The cold wind howled through the narrow streets of the small town, its icy fingers slipping through cracks in windows and biting at exposed skin. Frost clung stubbornly to the glass panes of Warm Brews, a cozy little cafe nestled at the corner of Main Street. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet energy, a comforting blend of the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the soft chatter of regular patrons. Behind the counter stood Claire, the cafe's barista. At 26, Claire exuded an unassuming warmth that seemed to match the cafe's snug interior. Her auburn hair was tied back into a loose ponytail, stray wisps framing a face marked by faint shadows under her hazel eyes, remnants of sleepless nights spent worrying over bills and memories of her father, whose recent passing had left her both grief-stricken and burdened with responsibility. Claire had been working at Warm Brews for 6 months, pouring lattes and listening to the stories of strangers. The cafe had become her refuge, a sanctuary from the aching emptiness of home. Yet, beneath her practiced smiles and kind words, there lingered an unspoken exhaustion. She often found herself wondering if life would ever become less heavy, less relentless. The morning was sluggish, the dreariness of the gray sky mirrored in the muted mood of the customers. Claire glanced at the clock mounted on the wall. It read 7:45 a.m. The regulars had claimed their usual spots. Mr. Daniels was engrossed in his crossword puzzle near the window, while a pair of college students hovered over their laptops, headphones in. Claire leaned against the counter, taking a brief moment to rub her tired eyes. Her coworker, Mia, was busy arranging pastries in the display case, humming a soft tune under her breath. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled. Claire looked up, expecting another familiar face, but instead, a man stepped inside. His appearance immediately drew her attention. He was tall but hunched, his threadbare coat hanging loosely over his frail frame. His shoes were scuffed and unevenly worn, and a knitted cap barely covered the disheveled gray hair peeking out from underneath. He clutched a battered backpack tightly against his chest as though it contained everything he owned. For a moment, the man hesitated at the entrance, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The warmth of the cafe seemed to beckon him, but he lingered as if unsure whether he was welcome. The contrast between the inviting interior and his weathered exterior was striking. Claire's heart twisted. She recognized the look in his eyes, a mixture of hope and fear, the silent plea of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Without thinking twice, she called out to him with a gentle smile, "Good morning. Come in and warm up." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly as he stepped inside, though he kept to the edges of the room. He gravitated toward a small table in the corner, far from the other patrons. Claire watched as he sat down, his fingers trembling as he removed his gloves. Mia glanced at Claire, raising an eyebrow. "Do you think he's going to order anything?" Claire shook her head. "Probably not. I'll take care of it." Reaching for a clean ceramic mug, Claire filled it with freshly brewed coffee and added a splash of cream. As she carried it over to the man's table, she couldn't help but notice how his hands rested on the table, calloused, cracked, and marked by years of hardship. "This one's on the house," she said softly, placing the mug in front of him. The man looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. His eyes, though sunken and tired, held a flicker of light that hadn't been there moments before. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "I didn't think anyone would notice me." Claire's throat tightened. "Everyone deserves to feel seen," she replied, her words earnest. As the man wrapped his hands around the warm mug, Claire returned to the counter. But her thoughts lingered on him. She wondered about his story. What had led him to this moment, sitting alone in a corner of her cafe? The morning crept forward. The man sat quietly, sipping his coffee, occasionally glancing out the window at the frost-covered street. He didn't ask for anything else, nor did he disturb anyone. Yet, his presence seemed to cast a contemplative hush over the room. When he finally stood to leave, he approached the counter where Claire was rinsing a stack of mugs. She looked up as he hesitated, clutching the straps of his backpack. "I don't have much to offer," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "but I want you to know, what you did today matters. Kindness has a way of rippling out into the world." Claire smiled, though the weight of his words pressed on her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, that could make a lasting difference in his life. But before she could respond, the man reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He flipped through its pages and tore one out carefully. Handing it to Claire, he said, "Keep this. It's a reminder that even the smallest gestures can carry great weight." She unfolded the piece of paper and saw the words scrawled in neat handwriting. "Every act of kindness creates a ripple no one can predict." By the time Claire looked up, the man was already halfway out the door. The bell jingled as he left, and she watched him disappear into the misty morning. She tucked the note into her apron pocket, feeling an inexplicable sense of foreboding and wonder. Something about his words, and the peculiar way he had said them, lingered in her mind like the scent of coffee that clung to her clothes. Claire didn't know it yet, but the ripple he spoke of was already in motion. The morning rush at Warm Brews faded into a quieter rhythm as the crowd thinned. Claire stood behind the counter, absently wiping the already clean surface. Her thoughts kept returning to the homeless man who had left hours earlier. His frail hands, the way he clutched the coffee cup like it was a lifeline, and those cryptic words, "Kindness always circles back." Claire reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, metallic object he had left behind. A weathered keychain with an engraved medallion that read A. Colburn. She had almost handed it to him as he left, but something in his demeanor made her hesitate. Now, she wondered if holding onto it was a mistake. As lunchtime drew closer, the cafe began to fill again. Students with their laptops, office workers grabbing coffee to go, and the regulars. All of them were talking about the man. "Did you see him?" A woman whispered to her friend at a nearby table. "Yeah, poor guy," her friend replied. "But did you notice the way he looked at people? Almost like he was sizing them up." Claire's stomach nodded. The words were harsh but not entirely false. The man's gaze had been piercing, as though he could see right through everyone, including her. At the corner table, where the man had sat that morning, Mr. Daniels, the retired teacher, was holding court with his usual group of friends. "I heard him muttering something as he left," Mr. Daniels said, his voice low but animated. "Something about how things would change. Maybe he's one of those eccentrics," another person speculated. "You know, like those guys who live on the streets but are secretly geniuses." Claire tried to focus on her work, but the murmurs and speculations gnawed at her. Her co-worker Mia, ever cheerful, slid up beside her. "Earth to Claire," Mia teased, snapping her fingers. "What's with you today?" "Nothing," Claire lied, stuffing the keychain deeper into her pocket. "You've been in a daze all morning," Mia pressed. "Is this about that guy?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. "It's just, something about him felt off. Like he wasn't just some random person." Mia shrugged. "You're overthinking. You gave him coffee. You were kind. End of story." But Claire's unease only deepened as the day unfolded. Around noon, the cafe was buzzing with activity. Orders piled up, and Claire and Mia worked in tandem to keep up with the demand. Yet, the atmosphere felt charged. Several unfamiliar faces lingered in the cafe. A man in a dark coat sat by the window, nursing the same cup of coffee for over an hour. Another figure, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, was seated near the back, his eyes darting around the room. "Do you recognize any of them?" Claire whispered to Mia as she handed over a tray of pastries. Mia glanced around and shook her head. "Nope, but they're probably just random customers." "You're being paranoid." Maybe Mia was right, Claire thought, but her instincts told her otherwise. The tension reached a tipping point when the cafe phone rang. Claire, caught off guard, answered. "Warm Brews, this is Claire speaking." There was a pause, followed by a gravelly voice. "The man who was in your cafe this morning, did he leave anything behind?" Claire's grip tightened on the receiver. "Who is this?" "That doesn't matter." The voice replied, curt and firm. "Did he leave a keychain? Or a note?" Her heart pounded as she glanced at the pocket where the keychain rested. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The caller hung up without another word. Claire set the phone down, her hands trembling. Why would someone call about the man? And why did they sound so urgent? As the afternoon wore on, whispers about the homeless man's identity grew louder among the patrons. He could be a former CEO who lost everything, someone suggested. Or maybe an artist, another added. You never know with these kinds of people. Mr. Daniels chimed in, his tone conspiratorial. I bet he's running from something, or someone. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing the point. The man hadn't just been a curiosity or a mystery to solve. He was someone who needed help. And yet, there was no denying the strange aura he had left behind. The bell above the door jingled, and two men entered the cafe. Dressed in impeccably tailored suits, they radiated authority. The room fell silent as the strangers scanned the space, their eyes sharp and calculating. The taller of the two approached the counter. We're looking for a man who was here earlier today, he said, his voice calm but firm. Gray hair, worn coat. Did he leave anything behind? Claire's pulse quickened. She glanced at Mia, whose wide-eyed expression mirrored her own. Why are you looking for him? Claire asked, trying to keep her voice steady. That's not your concern, the man replied. If he left anything here, we need it. Claire hesitated. Her fingers brushed against the keychain in her pocket. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, but the weight of the stranger's stares made her falter. Finally, she placed the keychain on the counter. The man picked it up, examining it briefly before slipping it into his pocket. Thank you for your cooperation, he said before turning to leave. As the men exited, the cafe erupted into hushed whispers. Who were they? Someone asked. Did you see the car they came in? Another added. Through the window, Claire watched as the men climbed into a sleek, black vehicle parked across the street. The car idled for a moment before disappearing into the growing dusk. Claire's thoughts swirled. Who was the homeless man? What did the keychain mean? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The rest of the day passed in a haze. Claire worked mechanically, her mind racing with questions. As she locked up the cafe that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her small act of kindness had set something much larger in motion. The world outside the cafe had darkened. Evening cast long shadows through the windows, reflecting the warm glow of the interior against the cold, dim streets. Claire stood near the counter, absently stacking paper cups, her mind still on the men in suits. Their authoritative presence lingered, making the air feel heavier. Are you okay? Mia's voice broke through the silence. Claire nodded but didn't answer. She had been lost in thought since the strangers left, her mind tangled in questions. What could they possibly want with the keychain? And why had the homeless man seemed so deliberate? It was as though he knew this moment would come. The sound of the doorbell startled Claire. She turned to see a small group of patrons entering, their chatter filling the space. For a brief moment, the cafe felt normal again. She took their orders, pasted on a smile, and tried to shove her unease aside. But her reprieve was short-lived. The door jingled again, and Claire's stomach dropped. The men in suits had returned. This time, they weren't alone. With them was a woman dressed in a crisp navy blazer, her expression unreadable. Her sharp eyes swept the room, locking onto Claire like a hawk spotting prey. The cafe grew silent. The usual hum of voices and clinking cups stilled as patrons sensed something unusual unfolding. Claire, isn't it? The woman asked, her voice calm but commanding. Claire swallowed hard. Yes. How can I help you? The woman smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. I understand you encountered a man here this morning. He left something behind. I already gave it to them, Claire said, gesturing toward the suited men. Yes, the keychain, the woman replied. But we believe he may have left more than that. Claire hesitated, her thoughts racing. What else could they want? She thought about the MN's cryptic words, his piercing gaze, and the odd stillness he carried with him. I don't know what you mean, she said carefully. The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. The man you helped this morning isn't who you think he is. He's important, and we need to find him. Anything you remember, even the smallest detail, could help. Why? Claire asked, her voice steadier now. Who is he? The woman exchanged a glance with one of the men. For a moment, Claire thought they wouldn't answer. Then the woman leaned in slightly. His name is Alan Colburn, she said. He's been missing for years. He's not just a homeless man. He's the founder of a major tech company. Or rather, he was. The words hit Claire like a freight train. Alan Colburn. The name was vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place it immediately. Why would someone like that be on the streets? Claire asked, disbelief coloring her tone. That's what we're trying to figure out, the woman said. Mr. Colburn disappeared 5 years ago after stepping down from his company. His family believes he's been living off the grid, avoiding media and public attention. But there's more at stake here than just his whereabouts. Claire's mind reeled. The man she had served coffee to this morning wasn't just anyone. He was someone with a story so vast it didn't fit into the humble confines of her cafe. And the keychain? Claire asked. What's so special about it? The woman's lips tightened. It's complicated. Let's just say it's tied to something valuable. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Claire felt a mix of emotions. Shock, confusion, and a twinge of fear. Had she unknowingly stepped into something far bigger than herself? And what about Alan? Was he safe? Why would he come here? Claire asked. That's what we're trying to figure out, the woman repeated. But I think you might know more than you realize. Claire hesitated, then reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a crumpled napkin. She had found it under the man's empty coffee cup after he left. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was trash. Now, it seemed anything but ordinary. The napkin was scrawled with jagged handwriting. Kindness isn't free, but it always pays. The woman took the napkin, her eyes narrowing as she read the words. Did he say anything to you? Claire thought back to their brief conversation. He said something about kindness circling back, she recalled. And he thanked me. That's all. The woman studied Claire, as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. Then she handed the napkin to one of the suited men. We need to act fast, she said, her voice low but urgent. As the men in suits moved toward the door, one of them paused and turned back to Claire. If he comes back, or if you hear from him, you need to let us know immediately. Claire nodded, though she wasn't sure what she would do if Alan did return. Part of her felt protective of him, despite barely knowing him. The group left, their departure leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. The cafe buzzed with speculation after they were gone. What was that about? Mia asked, wide-eyed. Claire shook her head. I'm not sure, but I think we just met some very powerful people. What do they want with him? That's the part one don't understand, Claire admitted. But whatever it is, it feels big. As the evening wore on, Claire's mind remained fixated on Alan. Who was he, really? Why had he come to Warm Brews of all places? Her shift ended, and she locked up the cafe, stepping out into the cool night air. As she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Turning a corner, she froze. Across the street, a figure stood under a flickering street lamp. It was Alan. Their eyes met, and he gave her a faint smile. Then he turned and disappeared into the shadows. The days following Alan's disappearance from the cafe felt like an uneasy calm had settled over the place. Warm Brews still had the same warm aroma of freshly ground coffee and the comforting hum of casual conversation, but it was different now. The cafe no longer felt like the safe little sanctuary it once had. Something had shifted. Claire was washing dishes when she first saw the sweet men again. She hadn't expected to see them so soon. Their sharp presence cut through the quiet buzz of the morning, as if they'd materialized out of thin air. This time, they weren't there to question her. They were there to offer answers. One of the men, the one with the graying hair and steel blue eyes, approached her as she dried a cup. Claire, he said softly, his tone more measured now, less intimidating. We thought we'd speak with you. Her heart skipped a beat. She had hoped they'd forgotten about her, but clearly they hadn't. About what? Claire asked, unsure whether to be nervous or curious. The man glanced around the cafe, as though to ensure there was no one else within earshot. About Alan Colburn, he said, lowering his voice even further. We owe you some explanation. Claire wiped her hands on the apron, bracing herself. She had suspected there was more to the man's story than she had initially realized, but hearing his name spoken so plainly made it feel real. The truth is, the man continued, his eyes fixed on Claire's, Alan Colburn was a former CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company. He stepped down 5 years ago, but there were rumors that he went off the grid, vanished on purpose. What we didn't know was why. Claire blinked, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he was saying. But why was he here? In my cafe? The man hesitated, and for a moment, Claire felt the weight of his silence. He's been living in hiding for years. Not because he wants to avoid his family or wealth, but because he's on the run from something much bigger than himself. Something dangerous. Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. But he seemed so, Ordina_RY. Just a man, sitting there, drinking his coffee. How could he be connected to all of that? He's not just a missing CEO, the man explained, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He's part of something much larger, something involving corporate espionage, government deals, and a financial crisis that could have shaken the entire world. But Alan got out before it all exploded. The keychain he left behind is part of a chain of evidence that could expose everything. A chill ran down Claire's spine. She had been right all along to sense that this had been more than a random encounter. But how could a simple gesture, offering a coffee, turn into something so far-reaching? As the man continued to explain, Claire's mind swirled with thoughts of what she had just learned. She had helped this man, this enigmatic figure who was not only a former titan of industry, but someone now wrapped up in a vast conspiracy she could never have imagined. Yet, her instinct to help had drawn him into her life. Does he know what's at stake? Claire asked. Does he know what he's running from? The man's expression softened, a slight flicker of compassion in his eyes. He knows, and for a time, he thought he could leave it all behind. But the truth is, he can never escape his past. We think he's been trying to warn those around him, by leaving behind subtle messages, like that keychain. As the conversation drew to a close, the man handed Claire a card, one with a simple number and a name written on it. David Klein, investigative agent. Contact us if you hear from him again, the man said. Alan is more than just a missing person now. He's part of something much bigger, and we need to keep him safe. As they left, Claire stood there, still holding the card in her hand. The weight of the day's events pressed on her, and she had to take a moment to gather her thoughts. The next few days passed in a blur, but as the cafe returned to normal, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that her life had changed irrevocably. The small act of kindness she had shown to a stranger had led her into the midst of a mystery, one she was unsure she could untangle. But it wasn't just the secrets of Alan Colburn that lingered with her. The whole experience had made her rethink her perspective on the world. She had seen the judgment from some customers in the cafe when Alan first entered. She had felt the uncomfortable glances and whispers. Yet, she had chosen to act out of kindness, even when it was inconvenient. Now, she was beginning to see those same customers with new eyes. Some of them, who had previously been aloof or indifferent, now smiled at her a little longer. The older couple that always sat in the corner booth, once grumbling about the small talk they were forced to endure, had started to chat more openly with the other regulars. There was a subtle shift in the air at Warm Brews. People were kinder, more patient. The small acts of kindness that Claire had once given without thinking were now reciprocated. It was as if the simple gesture of offering a homeless man a coffee had sparked something deeper in those who had witnessed it. On her way to work any morning, Claire passed by a homeless man sitting outside a convenience store. He was bundled up in a coat, his face tired and weathered, much like the man from the cafe. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a few bills. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked over and handed them to him. He looked up at her with surprise, then gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. For a moment, Claire was flooded with the memory of Alan's eyes, the way he had looked at her before he vanished. She had no idea if her gesture would lead to anything significant, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She had made a choice, one that felt right, and somehow, she knew that whatever came next, whether it was a simple connection or something much bigger, she would be ready. The power of kindness, she realized, wasn't just in the act itself, but in the ripples it created, both seen and unseen. That night, as Claire closed the cafe, she noticed the same man she had seen earlier, the one who had been sitting outside the convenience store, walk into warm brews. His face was still tired, his clothes worn, but his eyes were different now. He looked at her with a new understanding, a quiet acknowledgement. And for the first time, Claire didn't see him as a homeless man. She saw him as another person, another soul, who had simply wandered too far from where he belonged. She smiled as he ordered his coffee, a small moment of quiet connection between them. The world was full of stories, Claire realized. Stories like Alan's, full of secrets and unknown depths. But there were also simple stories, the stories of small kindnesses, moments of connection that made the world feel a little less lonely. The weeks that followed Alan's sudden disappearance were a blur of thoughts, reflections, and quiet shifts in Claire's perspective. Warm brews had returned to its usual rhythm. The hum of the espresso machine, the soft conversations of regulars, and the gentle clink of coffee cups. But the events of that fateful day had cast a long shadow over her, one that she couldn't shake. Each morning as Claire made her way to work, she was keenly aware of the small moments, the shared glances with a stranger, the kindness in a smile, the brief conversation with a customer who would otherwise be lost in their own world. It was as if, since that day Alan had walked into the cafe, she saw the world through different eyes, eyes that had been awakened to the silent, often overlooked connections between people. At first, Claire had wondered if it had all been a dream. The men in suits, Alan's true identity, the strange phone call, and even the small, mysterious token he had left behind. It all seemed like something out of a novel. But as time passed, and as the weight of those encounters settled within her, she realized that what had happened wasn't just a random series of events. It was a chain of moments, set into motion by a single act of kindness. The very act of offering a cup of coffee had set off ripples that stretched far beyond her imagination. Alan's arrival at Warm Brews had been unexpected, a chance encounter. But it had been a turning point for her, too. She had reached out to a man who, on the surface, seemed like just another homeless person, another transient figure who floated through the city unnoticed. But through her simple act, she had unknowingly connected him to something much larger than either of them, something that would change the course of many lives. One evening, as Claire wiped down the counters at the end of her shift, she saw a small envelope placed neatly on the counter. There was no name, no return address, just her first name, Claire, written in elegant handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she wondered if it was something from the men in suits, perhaps a follow-up to their conversation. Curious and a bit apprehensive, she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, folded neatly in half. She unfolded it and began to read. Dear Claire, you don't know me, but I feel compelled to reach out to you. I was sitting in your cafe the day Alan came in, and I saw what you did for him. That small act of kindness changed everything for him, and, unknowingly, for me, too. I've been struggling with a difficult situation, one that has kept me at a distance from those around me. But seeing you offer something as simple as a cup of coffee to a man in need reminded me of what it means to be human. Your kindness opened my heart to something I thought I had long forgotten. I don't have much to give, but I wanted to leave you something as a token of my gratitude. Please accept this small donation, and know that it is from someone who believes in the power of kindness and connection. With deep appreciation, Anonymous. Claire sat tear for a moment, stunned by the letter. Her fingers trembled as she held it, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't even realized the impact her simple act had on others, much less someone she didn't know. And yet, here it was, this anonymous note, a reminder that kindness had far-reaching consequences, that it could touch lives in ways she would never fully comprehend. Along with the letter, there was a check, a substantial amount of money. Claire couldn't believe it. She had never thought of herself as someone who would receive anything in return for simply being kind. But now, with the envelope in her hand, she understood something deeper. Kindness didn't just change the recipient, it changed the giver as well. It set something into motion, like the ripples of water when a stone is dropped. You couldn't predict how far those ripples would reach, but you could feel their effect. The next morning, Claire placed the check in her pocket, not with the intention of cashing it, but as a reminder. A reminder that small gestures mattered, that kindness was never wasted, and that one person's actions could set off a chain reaction that could change the world in ways they would never fully know. As she made her way to work, she began to notice other small acts of kindness in her daily life. There was the woman who helped an elderly man carry his groceries, the young man who paid for a stranger's coffee, and the couple who stopped to help a lost child find their parents. It was everywhere, woven into the fabric of everyday life, invisible yet undeniable. And just like that, Claire understood. The world wasn't as cold and disconnected as it sometimes seemed. People were still capable of deep empathy, of reaching out to one another in meaningful ways. At Warm Brews, things had slowly returned to normal. The regulars were still the regulars, coming in every morning, ordering their usual drinks, and chatting with Claire as if nothing had changed. But she knew better. The world had shifted, even if only for a small moment. Alan's presence had opened a door, one that led Claire into a deeper understanding of human connection. Her reflections on that fateful day made her realize that, while she had done a good thing in offering Alan a cup of coffee, it was the smallest moments of kindness that made the greatest impact. It wasn't always about grand gestures or life-changing decisions. Sometimes it was as simple as a smile, a helping hand, or a few words of comfort. One day, as Claire prepared a coffee for a regular customer, he noticed a new face at the counter. A young woman, in her 20s, walked in, hesitated for a moment, and then approached the counter. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm sorry to bother you. I've seen you here before, and I just wanted to say thank you." Claire blinked, taken aback. "For what?" "For what you did for that man, the homeless one. Alan, I was here that day, and seeing you treat him like a person, it made me rethink everything. I was in a bad place myself, struggling with some things, but your kindness gave me hope. It made me realize that maybe I can change things for myself, too." The woman's words stuck Claire deeply. She had never thought about it this way, how her actions had echoed in the lives of others. But in that moment, she understood. The impact of kindness didn't always come from the person who received it. It also came from the person who gave it. Claire smiled at the woman, her heart swelling with warmth. "I'm glad it made a difference," she said softly. "And sometimes we just need to remember that we're all in this together." As the woman left the cafe, Claire stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. Alan had left, but his presence had remained. His story had changed her life, and in turn, it had changed others. The cafe, once just a place for caffeine and casual chatter, had become a space for transformation. Claire had witnessed firsthand the power of kindness, how it could ripple outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. She didn't know where the journey would lead, but she knew this. She would continue to be part of it. One cup of coffee, one kind gesture at a time. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Claire made her way to the counter, ready to serve the next person who walked through the door, knowing that even the smallest moments had the power to change everything.